Hello everyone, and welcome to the sixth session in the WERA International Research Network seminar series, webinar series on human rights education. We'd like to welcome everybody from wherever you are. I know you're from a wide range of locations. The seminar series is run on behalf of the Human Rights Education Review and the WERA the WERA International Research Network on Human Rights Education. It's the sixth in our series, and for those of you who've been following, you might be wondering when the next one is due. The next one is actually due on the 13th of October. Before I talk about today's topic and introduce today's speaker, I would like to draw everyone's attention to the fact that the research network is inviting participation from early career researchers. Early career researchers, we really want to engage with you on a much closer basis. And we propose to do that. I think somebody is not muted. If anybody hasn't muted, could you kindly do so? Thank you. So we propose to do that by encouraging a group within the research network to work on communicating and working most closely with those of you who are in the early part of your research career. So if you are a doctoral student or a person who's in the first 5 years since graduating from their doctorate and are interested in human rights education and or actually engaged in human rights education research, this group may be for you. You will continue, of course, to be part of the wider network and to participate in the activities of the wider network, but we hope to arrange some special activities for you, and we will be inviting applications to this group, and Piers has kindly put up a link in the chat this evening so that you can actually see where to contact the person. If you're invited to apply by the 30th of September, and if you have any questions before applying or need any guidance on applying, then Professor Hugh Starkey is the person who can advise you, and you can contact him by email. One of our members, Sue Gollifer, who's going to be speaking this evening, will be one of the coordinators of this group, but Sue doesn't plan to work alone. She plans to work closely with other early career researchers and would value the support of a second person to join her. So we will be inviting applications for people to join her, and the deadline is the 30th of September. So if you are interested, take a look. There's guidance on the HRER platform, and there's also explanation there on how to go about this. I hope that's clear to everyone. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Susan Gollifer, who's from the University of Iceland in Helsinki. What am I talking about? The University of Iceland in Reykjavik, and she's joining us to talk about her research on transformative human rights education. She's done some very, very interesting work with upper secondary school teachers and on their life stories and on their narratives as they relate to human rights education, and has some, I think, very interesting insights into how we might make human rights education a more transformative activity. So it is my real pleasure to give the floor to Sue. She will be talking for 30 minutes. And after that, we will, as usual, open up the floor for questions. And I would just ask you to bear in mind one thing. If you have questions, please try and put them in the chat or indicate what you'd like to ask in the chat, because we will take the first questions from people who've actually indicated there that they wish to ask something. And that's how we will do that. Please keep the chat free from other comments or reflections, and just leave the chat line open for messages directed at Sue in relation to her work. So thank you, Sue, and we're delighted to have you.
Thank you very much, Audrey. Can everybody hear me? Piers, are you my guide? You can hear, yes, okay. I'd just like to say good morning, actually, good afternoon, good evening, because I see that there's a range of different people here, and thank you so much for attending today. And my thanks to Audrey, to Hugh, to Piers, and the organisers of the Human Rights Education Review research webinars. I very much welcome this space to share what I've learned about human rights education and to engage in a conversation with you about my work, which is of course a work in progress and which can only continue to develop, informed by events such as this one that we are at today. And I am just going to start sharing my screen. Okay, yeah, you can all see that, yeah? So we'll just start with why I focus on human rights education. Well, my interest in human rights comes from my own experience as a student who never formally learned about human rights, and as an educator who never received training in human rights or human rights education, but who drew instead on life experiences in diverse country and education contexts, including the UK, Spain, Cambodia, and now Iceland. So I was born in the Solomon Islands, and I am of Guyanese and British descent, and I spent my formative education years in the UK. And I worked as an English language teacher in Spain before moving to Cambodia, where I worked as a teacher educator. It was in Cambodia that I was introduced to rights-based information in the form of UNICEF's Child-Friendly School Initiative and the power of legal literacy when working on girls' education and child labour projects. Reflection on these experiences led me to realise how education systems and educators like myself can perpetuate dominant interests and harmful practices. I'm just wondering why nothing's happening when I'm pushing my slides. I'm sorry about this, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing and I will try again. All right. So I was just saying that the experiences of being a teacher educator in the different country contexts that I was referring to actually led me to realize how education systems and educators can perpetuate dominant interests and harmful practices. But I also very much became aware of the potential of human rights education as a tool to ensure human well-being by addressing individual, state, and institutional accountability. So when I moved to Iceland, this critical introspection of my own lived reality as an educator in different country contexts led to my interest in working with teachers' narratives in particular socio-political, economic, and cultural contexts. Now, Iceland presents an interesting case given its global reputation as a paragon of equality and quality of life. It's the smallest of the Nordic countries in terms of number of inhabitants and has a growing migrant population, currently placed at 15% of the total population, which is now just over 360,000. Global reports that position Iceland as a gender paradise and the world's most peaceful nation can create complacency about the increasing ethnic and racial diversity, which has actually started to make visible violations of human rights in the form of educational disparities between immigrant and non-immigrant students at the upper secondary school level, and higher rates of domestic violence and sexual harassment in the private sphere amongst migrant women. So this is the country context of my work with human rights education in upper secondary schools. A country where human rights education is a relatively new field, and where I argue that human rights tends to be assumed under other more established social justice education approaches, such as multicultural education, inclusive education, citizenship education, and sustainability education. So using multiple data sets, which included the life stories of 10 upper secondary school teachers of different subject areas who self-identified as working with human rights, I sought to understand how teachers' life stories inform and extend understandings of transformative human rights education. And my purpose was to advocate for human rights education as an important contribution to existing social justice oriented education approaches, and to conceptualize a framework for teacher education to support transformative forms of human rights education. Now, the concept of transformative related to human rights education lies in its normative goal to generate change to ensure human well-being by creating a culture of human rights that prevents violations as defined within the framework of the International Bill of Rights. Research suggests that this requires transformative methodologies underpinned by critical pedagogy that leads to critical consciousness of personal and systemic constraints to well-being with the intention to address these. It further requires understanding that human rights are underpinned by core cosmopolitan human rights principles, creating links between the local, the national, and the global. These principles are universality, rights are applicable to all human beings, irrespective of who or where we are. Indivisibility, rights cover a broad spectrum of social, cultural, economic, political, and civil rights. And solidarity and reciprocity, rights are dependent on recognition of and reactions towards human vulnerability on a personal and systemic level. I also, in my work, situate human rights education in a social justice framework informed by Martha Nussbaum's capabilities framework, which I use as a minimum threshold of justice to ensure human dignity. Now, Nussbaum's capabilities frame transformation as the substantive freedom to be and do what one values in life. Social justice is therefore understood as what is effectively possible in terms of being or doing, creating a policy frame for certain conditions needed to ensure this freedom. And transformative forms of human rights education make visible and enable such conditions. So what does my analysis of teachers' stories reveal about the potential for transformative forms of human rights education in the Icelandic context? Now, the teachers' stories provide rich examples of cross-cultural experiences that shape the moral and the political convictions that underpin their reasons for working with human rights. Yet the tacit nature in which the majority of teachers express their reasons for working with human rights reflects a limited opportunity to critically reflect on their work. Now, when I use the term tacit, I refer to the fact that despite teachers self-identifying as working with human rights, their responses suggest a lack of an explicit intention to address human rights concerns as part of the course syllabus, and more reflect an unconscious pedagogical response to a moral or political conviction developed through life experiences and now manifested in the context of the subject that they are teaching. For example, if we look at Ella, an English teacher, she points out, I'm doing it very unconsciously. Until starting this project with you, I hadn't really thought of myself as using, human rights approaches. I haven't been very conscious of it, but it's just more part of who I am and what I think is important. Simon, a science teacher, states, I needed someone to talk to. I'm trying things out with you. I'm using you as a guinea pig and trying to explain how I'm thinking about the school. There is a strong suggestion in the majority of the stories that teachers use the interviews as an opportunity to share and make sense of what they're doing in the classroom. The invitation to participate in this study seems to have triggered the association between their work and human rights. Lack of critical reflection on moral and political convictions shaped through cross-cultural experiences can restrict the development of intention and purpose to achieve the normative goal of transformative human rights education. One teacher, for example, talked about a family trip to Mexico where she felt a sense of pride when her son wanted to give his shoes away to a boy on the street. Without the opportunity to examine this generous and impulsive act from a critical perspective, there is a risk of what Gorski refers to as forms of unconscious othering, or teachers addressing social justice concerns in ways that Sleater describes as generating neutrality, colorblindness, meritocracy, and false empathy. Without an opportunity to unpack such opportunities in ways that generate an explicit purpose of their work, teachers' dependence on tacit knowledge about how they think about things, such as schooling and social justice, risks allowing systemic and political conditions to remain unchallenged. In school contexts where human rights and human rights education are not a formal part of teacher education, and where teachers are predominantly white and from the dominant national heritage, as is the case in Iceland, not providing opportunities for these teachers to critically reflect on their reasons for associating their work with human rights can make issues of privilege and power invisible and perpetuate narrow understandings of human rights and human rights education, as was evident in the way the teachers talked about their practices. Now, teachers commonly referred to developing mutual respect, care, fairness, and empathy in particular was used by teachers in the context of developing socio-moral dispositions as key citizenship skills. Helga, a history teacher, refers to an elective human rights course that she describes as a kind of citizenship thing, where students experience 24 hours living as a refugee during a simulation activity facilitated by the Red Cross. She says, so that's probably what I'm hoping for, just a kind of better understanding towards those who are different in some way in school or out of it. Teachers' references to student-centered and participatory approaches reflect learning through human rights and Felissa Tibbetts' socialization human rights education model that emphasizes values and awareness. As in the case of Helga, most teachers place importance on horizontal relations to develop student capacity to understand each other and to better engage with the concept of the different other. An important feature of the narratives in two of the teachers' stories was the association with human rights and ensuring students' sense of well-being in relation to their academic performance. Simon, a science teacher, and Victor, a maths teacher, both focused on developing student confidence and a sense of worth in response to school systems that label students as able and not able in relation to meeting the requirements of core subjects such as maths, Icelandic, and English, referred to by Tumi, one of the teachers, as the masters of the universe. When you fail maths and you're not sure what you're going to do and your self-confidence isn't high, then you don't allow yourself to experiment and try different things. Simon in particular felt really strongly about the injustice of students dropping out of school because of feelings of inadequacy. It's almost like you have a machine gun. Why do these kids do so badly at school? Why am I seeing these kids, these nice kids, drop out in numbers? You know, I mean, literally, they drop out. The teachers pay less attention to developing student skills to engage in vertical relations, to understand injustices they are addressing from a point of view of legal accountability, such as in the case of the right to a quality education. This requires teachers knowing about the legal frames related to education, but also how to seek redress. There are references to the Icelandic constitution when teaching history or legal frameworks in the context of disability, but the legal dimension of human rights is not a main feature in the majority of the stories. Teachers acknowledged that learning about human rights was not a core part of their teaching. As Ilma, a cultural studies teacher, points out, I'm familiar with it, referring to domestic law, but it's not something that I thought of, you know, as being important. Anna, a gender study teacher, also acknowledges that although she is aware of the importance of knowing the law and she uses it in her feminist work outside of the school. She hasn't included it in her teaching. She says, I have not, in my work as a teacher, I have not put any effort or focus on that, but this conversation makes me just start thinking about it. The teacher's discussion of school culture and institutional context suggests that systemic constraints impact on the potential of transformative human rights education in upper secondary schools in Iceland. Jónasson argues that curriculum reform faces inertial constraints, and by this he refers to assumed acceptance of a system in ways that act as its preservation. Inertial constraints not only create a system that fails to support teachers who are committed to working with social justice, but which also makes acceptable a culture of non-accountability. Inertial constraints include dominant purposes of schooling, influencing how teachers feel about their work, as Selma explains. I'm constantly worried about not teaching English properly because I'm taking my students on a journey around the world. I enjoy so much when discussing with my students that sometimes I forget what I'm paid to do. Selma's reference to constantly worrying and forgetting what she's paid to do reflects a tension between how teachers perceive their role and their perception of what is expected by the upper secondary school system and education stakeholders such as students and parents and potential employers. And this is a common theme in the stories. Inertial constraints can also be connected to teachers' reference to a culture of self-regulation to describe a school system that places responsibility on individual teachers with minimal support or accountability. Simon points out, I'm deeply worried about my school. There is no discussion. I think that the leadership of the school is taking no responsibility. Vietnam's comment about the lack of resistance from the school board as regards how teachers respond to the national curriculum raises the concern that when general aims such as human rights are left to individual teachers, traditional systemic expectations can create teacher resistance to education reform. Conflicting expectations of schooling and teachers' self-regulation can keep content that is not considered academic content, such as human rights, on the periphery of the curriculum in the form of electives. This can lead to teacher disillusionment, as reflected in Ingimar's experience, who eventually left what he describes as a selective school system. It was the system and the expectations. I could work with that, and I found out that this is what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it. But both the system, the administrators and students, they have expectations of how a good class in this old selective upper secondary school that I teach in should look like. So what are the implications of these findings? Teachers draw on tacit and implicit reasons for working with human rights. Their practices predominantly reflect learning through human rights, and systemic constraints result in dilution and disillusionment. The absent legal dimension of human rights can lead to teachers trivializing human rights, and by this I mean emphasis is placed on classroom behavior and horizontal student relations, and/or talking about rights in the context of students' responsibilities towards each other. Rights become associated with being fair rather than addressing injustice. The tacit nature of teachers' reasons for working with human rights can also be linked to the absence of learning about human rights. Teachers predominantly associate human rights as a form of civics education. And research in Nordic countries suggests that human rights education, understood as a form of civics education, can risk being preservative rather than transformative when it fails to engage with systemic constraints to ensuring the social, cultural, economic, as well as civil and political well-being of all human beings. In particular, in country contexts where human rights have become assumed as part of the national identity. Learning through human rights is one of the three dimensions of the definition of human rights education as presented in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training. Iceland is a signatory to a number of international human rights obligations stating the right to human rights education in schools, including the 1948 morally binding Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the legally binding International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the legally binding Convention on the Rights of the Child. At the domestic level, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has been incorporated into Icelandic law, reaffirming human rights education as a legal responsibility. The 2018 Act on Equal Treatment, irrespective of race or ethnic origin, is the first comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation concerning race and ethnic origin in Iceland. And Article 10 of the Act explicitly prohibits discrimination on the basis of race or ethnic origin in schools and teaching institutions, justifying the need for human rights education in schools and universities. Target 4.7 of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development makes specific reference to developing knowledge and skills related to human rights as part of education. Various new government policies and programs have been linked to the SDGs, including a new development cooperation policy, as well as Iceland's climate action plan. So the University of Iceland has sustainability as a core component of its strategic plan, suggesting institutional responsibility to ensure human rights education, in particular through the School of Education. Yet, as previously mentioned, human rights remain assumed in other forms of social justice education, despite policies that promote human rights, such as the 2008 Education Act for upper secondary schools, and the 2011 National Curriculum Guide for all levels of schooling, which support the objectives in the 2008 Education Act, with 6 interdependent foundational pillars, which include democracy and human rights. And this was the first time that human rights had explicitly been included in the curriculum. Yet, the 2014 White Paper on Education Reform made no reference to human rights or human rights education, despite reporting on low upper secondary school completion and low achievement among students with an immigrant or foreign background. The paper failed to make the link between these concerns and violation of students' rights to and in education. And a review of courses run as part of the postgraduate diploma for teacher certification at the upper secondary school level suggests that addressing human rights is dependent on student teachers' choice of electives and instructors' pedagogical preferences or specialist research interests. Now, whatever we think of the World Programme or international bodies in terms of their role in ensuring human rights, it's important to acknowledge that as signatories to human rights conventions that include the right to human rights education, countries have a legal, moral, and political obligation. A review of the evaluation of the different phases of the World Programme for Human Rights Education suggests weak accountability towards this obligation in the Nordic context. However, submission of reports is not always indicative of accountability to human rights education. Although Nordic countries have not actively participated in submitting reports to the World Programme, some have established national human rights institutes, which are crucial independent bodies with the responsibility to protect and monitor human rights in a given country. The research work of the Danish and Finnish National Human Rights Institutes illustrates how these institutes can hold governments accountable to promote human rights education in formal schooling. Iceland is the only Nordic country that has not made any steps towards establishing a National Human Rights Institute. Depending on international organizations such as the United Nations to ensure accountability for human rights education at the national level is problematic. However, as Katarina Tomaszewski argued in her role as the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Education, rights to and in education are not a privilege, but are legal rights that cannot exist without corresponding government obligations. Iceland is failing in its legal obligation to ensuring human rights. So what can we, as researchers and educators, do about this? Felisa Tibbett proposes a conceptual understanding of 3 human rights education models based on a review of human rights education literature and her own work with human rights education. The values and awareness socialization model, which according to research is the most common model in formal schools, depends on student-centered and participatory methodologies, but does not necessarily seek change. The accountability professional development model favors participatory interactive methodologies aimed at instrumental empowerment to generate professional responsibility for human rights. And the activism transformation model intentionally seeks social change to address injustice. What I find useful about this conceptualization is that it illustrates disconnect between professional development, transformative pedagogy, and formal schooling. Transformative models of human rights education are more typically associated with the work of civil society organizations and non-government organizations and human rights activism, and not related to professional development, such as of teachers. Now, in contexts where human rights education is not a recognized field of education, as in Iceland, and where human rights are assumed in other social justice education approaches, we need to find opportunities and spaces to work with human rights in meaningful ways that lead to transformative models. Given the inertial constraints to human rights education in schools, I suggest that it is problematic to discuss human rights education as a transformative pedagogy in the context of conservative upper secondary schools. I propose that instead of solely focusing on systemic conditions to support transformative forms of human rights education, we instead also need to look at developing the human condition through teacher education that aims to develop teachers' transformative agency as a means of creating and sustaining human rights cultures in schools in Iceland. By focusing on the teacher rather than only on the system, I'm not suggesting that the state has no responsibility. The state and education institutions are ultimately responsible, given that Iceland has signed and ratified multiple international human rights documents related to human rights education. I am instead, as an educator, trying to find a way to do justice to the transformative intentions of human rights education. And my conceptualization of human rights education practice, based on my findings, is a starting point. Using my findings, I conceptualize teacher education that creates a pedagogical space for teachers of all subject areas to critically and collectively engage in understanding the curriculum pillar of democracy and human rights in relation to their personal and professional lives. I draw on the work of Gert Biester to propose subjectification as a theoretical base that positions teaching and learning as intrinsic or relational engagement through interactions with diverse others in order to bring new beginnings into the world and in order to generate some form of action. The capacity to act as a subject is dependent on plurality, a plurality that helps us to better understand not only who we are, but also how we are in the world as subjects. Subjectification in the context of teacher education lends itself well to the notion of transformative agency as a pedagogical intention leading to intrinsic forms of action. And Monisha Bajaj proposes a combination of 4 interrelated components to generate transformative agency. She talks about strategic agency, understood as the capacity to engage in strategic and deliberate analyses of future action. Relational agency, which refers to the cultivation of agency through interaction and collaboration to generate critical consciousness and the desire to act in the face of injustice. Coalitional agency, which situates struggles for justice within broader social justice frames. And sustained agency, which is the capacity to act independently in response to injustice. I propose 5 pedagogical principles based on my findings that I believe could support the development of teachers' transformative agency towards human rights. Applying a content and context-based approach, the findings suggest that teachers' human rights knowledge should include information about non-Western isomorphic equivalence and the history behind the drafting of international and domestic moral and legal frameworks as part of developing a human rights episteme or knowledge base. And this needs to also include legal literacy, including a study of violations of human rights in local contexts such as schools, and also global contexts, and how legal systems have failed certain members of society. And the reasons for these failings. Struggles for justice create important contexts for developing knowledge of human rights from a legal perspective, while teachers' own narratives provide important insights into the moral and political dimensions of human rights. A study of such content and context should be explicitly related to social justice as a core purpose of education. Human rights are often discussed without making reference to a social justice framework. leaving rights to be addressed as abstract concerns through student-centered and participatory methodologies, which are often understood as evidence of democratic education taking place in schools. In certain school contexts, this can make invisible minority or diverse voices, as more popular and mainstream representation tends to dominate. In my findings, teachers refer to the student councils in upper secondary schools as an example of perpetuating unjust hierarchies in schools. Developing critical consciousness of inertial constraints to education, ensuring multiple and diverse perspectives to recognize and encourage cosmopolitan ways of being and doing, and last but not least, understanding educators and students as knowledgeable subjects through shared narratives all provide possibilities for creating learning contexts and content needed to develop transformative agency. This is a work in progress. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, I've recently finished my professional doctorate, and I have yet to test out this conceptualization in my role as an adjunct at the School of Education here at the University of Iceland. So I look forward to your comments, your own experiences of human rights education in the context of teacher education, and your questions, so that I can further develop my thoughts on transformative forms of human rights education and continue to challenge any internal conflict and the mourning of deep-seated attachments that are harmful to ourselves and to others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you very much for a very thorough and intense collection of ideas here. We have many participants in this webinar from around the globe. I can see people present from Nigeria, from South Africa, from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, from all over Europe. And I'm sure that many of them will have questions, and it's not too late, everyone, to just type in your questions or type in the topic you would like to ask Sue about. I'm going to hand over to my fellow coordinator of the International Research Network on Human Rights Education, Hugh Starkey, to chair the questions. But I would like to say a very warm thank you to Sue for that stimulating discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. That's really good. And you, we're very much looking forward, I think, to seeing a version of that in print in Human Rights Education Review in due course. But hopefully we'll be able to see that the analysis is quite intense, and I think we probably need also a bit of time to kind of interiorize that narrative. Can I suggest to participants, it's absolutely fine if you put your camera on now. It's actually quite nice to see who's here and to recognize friendly and well-known faces. It's best if you keep your mic off until you're invited to speak. There are two ways of being invited to speak. The first one is to put a question in the chat, and the second one is to put your hand up. And you put your hand up by going at the bottom of your screen, the reactions button, and there you can see a button that says put your hand up. So in the chat, we actually have several questions already, and Piers was off to an early start, and he was interested, as someone also at a relatively similar stage in his research journey, he was interested in your methodology and particularly how you chose the students. Could you just, sorry, the teachers and their narratives, how did that process go, Sue?
Sure, yeah, thanks Piers for that question. It's a really interesting question because when I arrived in Iceland, I was very new within the university, and as you can imagine, there's a very small population, and so the academic population is even smaller, and then the upper secondary school context is even smaller. And people tend to know each other within education. So I was coming in as an outsider, but also as an insider, because my husband is Icelandic and I had a child in the Icelandic school context. So I adopted that position of outsider, insider. And I spent actually the first 2 years of my studies just familiarizing myself with the upper secondary school education context. I went into schools, I co-taught with teachers, I spoke to principals, and this was done quite informally, and I kept a journal throughout. And this was really just to help me to get to know the field that I was going to research. And then what I did in my 3rd year, when I'd actually managed to construct a methodological approach, or how I was going to go about this research, I used gatekeepers. So I sent out a letter of invitation to people I knew within the School of Education. And what they did was that they either sent it out directly to teachers they knew, who they thought would be interested in taking part, or what they did was send me a name and I contacted those teachers directly. I had about 32 teachers in the end, as I recall, and then of course some dropped off because of the timing, and life happens. And I decided in the end to work with 10 teachers who, not representative, not to represent upper secondary school teachers at all, but who I felt would give me deep insights into their experiences as different subject teachers. So I wanted to make sure that I had science teachers, maths teachers, language teachers, etc. Does that answer your question? Please ask me if I don't. If we can have a dialogue too, if there's stuff I haven't covered.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that comprehensive answer, Sue. Actually, I was the second person to ask a question, so I'll ask it. Because you gave one example of a human rights education activity, I think, which was a simulation, living as a refugee for 24 hours. But unless I missed it, that was probably the only concrete example we had of what the teachers told you about exactly when and how they did human rights education. So could you give us a bit more detail on the simulation about the refugee? And can you think of any other examples that your teachers gave you of concrete teaching situations where they were actually introducing human rights concepts?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question, Hugh, because I think it goes back to the finding that teachers did tend to associate human rights education with developing socio-moral dispositions and student-centered methodologies and participation. Now, that example was in the context of an elective, and I think that's really important to understand in the upper secondary school context and how it works, that teachers who are interested in developing activities around human rights education have to do this in the context of electives outside of the main subject areas. And so Helga, the history teacher, who was very interested in working with the experiences of refugees, because at that time there were a lot of stories in the media and in the press in Iceland of migrants trying to enter boats in order to go to different country contexts. And for her, she worked with the Red Cross because she knew that they did this simulation where they went for 24 hours and they didn't have food. They didn't have access to being able to go out of the context or the setting where they were. They didn't have their phones with them, etc. Basically, for her, it was taking the students out of their own lived reality. And she used that very much as an example she felt that had had a huge impression on those students, in the sense that they'd never experienced anything like that, even though, I mean, this is in no way an experience of a migrant, if you get what I mean. But for her, it was just an important opportunity for them to just experience being out of their own comfort zone. Another example was Tumi, actually, who created a game. And he created a game where students had to identify their own political parties, they had to identify their own platforms, and they were basically able to focus on and create anything that they wanted to within that context. And they were also able to, you know, change allegiances and explain why they were changing allegiances and what was the most important aspect of each of the political parties that they were siding with, for want of a better word. So, but I think what's important here is that these were actually, now that you said, these were the two main activities, both electives, and in both cases, these teachers were dependent on students signing up for these electives, and they didn't in the second time round that they didn't get enough numbers. And as Tumi pointed out, you know, it's really hard when you're competing with other electives, which are a ski trip, for example.
Could I just push you slightly on that? Because the two examples you gave could have been situated in social studies, in political education. I don't hear very precisely the human rights content in them. And I just wonder what you think about that, how you react to that.
Absolutely, and I think that's actually what I'm saying in my thesis. The reason for that, for me, is because of this tacit awareness that teachers have of their work around human rights. For them, this was very much the first opportunity that they had to talk about human rights. And that's why in that conceptualization for teacher education, I talk very much about building teachers' knowledge of human rights. That becomes essential in any teacher education program, because these teachers are doing an amazing job. And I just take my hat off to them, the humility of their narratives when they talk about, I'm trying to do what I think is right, but I don't know. There's very much that we need some kind of program where we're able to explore what does it actually mean to address human rights in the context of the curriculum. And that informs the conceptualization that I proposed at the end.
Thanks, Sue. I'd now like to invite Michael Green, who's still with us, I think, to unmute. And would you ask your question, Michael?
Sure, thank you. The evaluation you mentioned that was going on from 2005 and continuing seemed to me to be a process evaluation, how well the program is being implemented as designed. And I was wondering if there are any parallel evaluations that look at outcomes. That is, does it reduce the inequities? Does it get students to engage in social justice action? Does it create the transformation that the programs are designed to affect?
Okay, thanks, Michael. Are you referring to, which evaluation were you referring to?
I didn't write it down, but the world evaluation that started.
Okay. So that was the World Human Rights Education Program, which is coordinated by the United Nations. That's very so. How that works is that different countries send in midterm and reports and final reports in response to the different phases of the human rights education program. And so they're very, and it's actually a really interesting question, because I looked at some of these reports, and they tend to be filled in by ministry officials. So the depth or the detail within those reports very much depends on the extent to which a ministry official has actually collected the data within the schools. Now, when I spoke to the teachers myself, none of them had heard of this evaluation form at all. So I think there is no evidence, for example, in the Icelandic context of any detailed reporting going on which collects data from schools within that framework, within the framework of the World Programme for Human Rights Education. But this is actually something that we really want to start to do now, based on this piece of research and based on interests of my colleagues as well at the School of Education, to actually, so we have two parts of it in a way. You have like the accountability of a state to report to the World Programme for Human Rights Education. So what we can do as educators and researchers is we can collect that information and that data within school contexts, and hopefully encourage them to use that within the reporting system. So does that answer your question?
Sort of. I mean, it sounds like the reports that are submitted for the CRC implementation. My question is really directed, is there any research out there that looks at the effect of the human rights education when it's implemented well? It's intended, obviously, to create the kinds of transformations you talked about, to get students to schools and students and teachers to engage in social action. So my question is really, if it, to the extent that programs are implemented as designed, and I understand the problems in the reporting, does that really generate the kinds of outcomes that we hope and expect will derive from the implementation of human rights education?
Yeah, I'm going to actually ask perhaps Audrey and Hugh to if they know of any of this kind of reporting going on. But there is research, and there are examples of what I would call transformative forms of human rights education taking place, but not as a report as such, just individual context. So, for example, the work of I know their surnames because that's how I always quote them: Spreen, Monaghan, and Hillary. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of these human rights education academics from New York University, where they combine a university and high school course, integrating university students with high school students of refugee and migrant and diverse socioeconomic realities, and show that there is some very transformative outcomes there. But in terms of a comprehensive report around transformative human rights education in action and its outcomes, I'm not sure, but it's something that I think, if it isn't there, needs to be done, definitely.
I think we can give Audrey a last word at the end of the session, and she may be able to comment on that. It would be nice to just have a brief comment, please, from a couple of people who've indicated in the chat. And I can see Anne Becker has also got her hand up. So perhaps Mohammed Islam from Bangladesh, would you like to make a brief comment?
Yes, thank you so much. Very interesting presentation. Are you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Actually, I did a very similar study. I completed my PhD from Monash University, Melbourne, Australia, and I very similar study, and I found that the teacher of Bangladesh in his schools, they are more concerned about completing the syllabus, student syllabus, their main focus, and just student result, rather than the promoting the values of child rights or human rights. So my question is, do you find anything like this in your study, in your context? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I would be very interested. I hope you put in the chat your name and the title of your thesis as well, because I'd very much like to read it.
Okay, thank you.
But I mean, remember that I worked with teachers who self-identified as
yeah.
working with human rights education. So, but they talked about this in terms of school cultures and in terms of resistance to curriculum reform, where teachers were more influenced by students' expectations of schooling and parents' expectations of schooling, rather than what it said in the curriculum, which clearly states there that democracy and human rights is one of the fundamental pillars, and we need to find ways to work with it within the context of schooling.
Thanks, Sue. Let's just see quickly if Xiaoyu Wang is available and would like to say, ask the question about students' perceptions. Xiaoyu?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, yeah.
Speak up.
Yeah, thanks for your introducing about human rights education. I just interested that, you know, I'm in China, that there, in my experience, there are not human rights education. My question is that under the competitive assessment, I mean, the culture, that they pay more attention on the academic results. So how students or parents perceive the human rights education? Thanks for that.
Can you give a brief response to that, Sue?
I can. I mean, I think that's something we need to work on. I think we actually, I think perhaps parents are not really aware perhaps of what's in the curriculum, and perhaps there are conversations that we need to have together with different stakeholders involved to raise this issue.
But thanks for raising that, Xiaoyu. Anne has been quite keen to get in for perhaps a final brief comment.
Thank you. Thank you. I found your presentation very interesting. I just want to make a comment, maybe a question on transformative human rights education and critical consciousness. In South Africa as well, human rights education is part of citizen education. And I've been lately reading and working on, maybe you can comment on that. How does citizen education affect the transformative nature of human rights education? Because citizen education is about the good citizen, in South Africa specifically, social cohesion, tolerance, and this and that. And doesn't that actually discourage critique and critical thinking and challenging and the transformative nature of human rights? I don't know. I mean, that's in South Africa. I don't know if this is a global thing. I don't know.
Thanks, Anne, for raising that challenge about the relationship with citizenship education and so on. So perhaps just a very brief final word.
I completely agree. Perhaps I should say that just quickly is that for me, human rights education, if we understand it as transformative and being underpinned by those cosmopolitan principles, I think what it offers to citizenship education is a broader mandate. And in country contexts, such as in Iceland, where citizenship is seen quite narrowly within the nation state. So, for example, if you're not a citizen, what happens to your rights anyway? So that's where you start thinking about the human aspect of human rights. And that's why I prefer to work with human rights education, but not dismiss other forms of social justice education either, but just to encourage to really think about who is that human when we talk about human rights.
Thanks so much, Sue. And I'm going to hand back to Audrey for a last word to round up our webinar.
Well, again, thank you, Sue, very, very much for this wide-ranging coverage of a very in-depth study that you've done. And I realise you can't cover every aspect in a session like this. Just to pick up on what Michael said, I don't think that there are comparative studies internationally that go into human rights education as a transformative process in any detail. I think there are one or two comparative studies like that of Carol Hahn that's published in Human Rights Education Review, which kind of takes snapshots of what's going on in different countries. But I don't think human rights education has really been funded as an in-depth study internationally. I think probably the best work on understanding transformative human rights education are those small scale studies that look either at one school or at a group of schools. And I think sometimes they give insights to our Chinese colleagues' reflection on the pressing issues of school results, parents' concerns, and so on, which are sometimes in competition with human rights education. So I think we do recognize that that's going on, not just in China, that there are competing elements in the curriculum like that, but there are in many, many different settings. So I would like to thank Sue for raising these important issues, to participants for highlighting some gaps in our research agenda, and to stress to all of you who are still with us today that if you have studies, if you have research, even if you published it as a PhD, that you would like to actually present a paper to the journal for consideration, we would love to see it. We've had one or two of our authors here with us. Anne is one of our authors. I think, were here earlier from Nigeria. We really, really do welcome your participation. So it isn't just Sue's paper that we're waiting for to review at Human Rights Education Review, but we're actually waiting to review your work. And we do encourage you to pursue your work with energy. That's the purpose of our network, is to support each other in pursuing that work, not just as early career researchers, but established researchers often get distracted by other commitments of their jobs, and to really consider whether you have a paper, whether you are able to contribute to this network in forwarding this agenda of human rights education. So thank you all for participating. Thank you for your incisive and reflective questions. And we look forward to you joining us on the 13th of October at the same time. And details of how to do that should be posted very, very early next week. So we encourage you to sign up soon for our webinar on the 13th of October, when Lee Jerome and his colleagues will be presenting their work, which is already published in Human Rights Education Review. So I'd just like to say goodbye to everybody and thank you for your contributions from around the globe. Thank you.